Maybe you know someone who can manage situations well so that things result favorably for them. They are good with their words. Maybe they can play on emotions, so they kind of always end up getting exactly what they want. If you're careful with your words, which is a wise thing to do, you'd call them maybe an outcome engineer. If you call a spade, you just say they are manipulative. That word, of course, it carries a lot of baggage, right? And rightly so. But really, all it means is when someone tries to control or influence a situation or a person. And sometimes that's with deception, but sometimes it's not. I can't tell you how many times a day I try to convince my children to do exactly what I want them to do. I am always, short on brain space as I just try to engineer ways. How do I get these kids to behave in a way that I want them to behave? And often, it's going to be good for them as well if they behave the way I want them to behave. And of course, it's going to be good for me too. Now, the equation that I use most often to try to do this with my kids, and you probably have as well, it's something like this. If you will, fill in the blank, then I will. If you will eat your vegetables, then I will give you dessert. If you will stop biting your sister, then I will stop giving you timeouts, right? So stuff like that. But kids are smart. I forget that. Kids are smart. And they have realized, if I want to get my way, I need to do what Daddy does. And so they use the same thing on me. Daddy, if you will buy me this toy, I will never ask for anything again, right? Daddy, if you let me eat this cookie, I promise you I will stop using glitter on my crafts. I always fall for that one. I hate glitter. It's from the devil anyway. But this isn't just a parent-kid dynamic, right? This type of if you will, then I will dynamic goes across all sorts of areas of our life. In our work, right? The contractual obligation. If you will pay me, then I will show up and fulfill my duties as an employee. In our relationships, if you are honest with me, then I will trust you. With our finances, if this product will bring me comfort or happiness or some sort of utility, then I will spend my hard-earned money on it. It's the most common bargaining chip that we use. If you will, then I will. The election is upon us. In just over a week, we're going to be going to the polls to choose the next leader of our election. And as far as I can tell, this is how the election process works. Now, politics are way out of my scope, but this, as far as I can tell, this is how it works. If you will, then I will. If you will lower taxes, then I will vote for you. If you will do something about the economic situation that will benefit me directly, then I'll support you. If you see the world the way that I see the world, you can put a sign on my lawn. We make these minor, but also these major decisions based off this bargaining process. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying it's a thing. It's just kind of what we do. It's how we operate. But have you ever bargained with God? Have you ever had a sort of cosmic contract with God? If you will, God, then I will. I've had one of those. And my guess is that many people in here have as well. At one point or another, even someone who would consider themselves totally irreligious, at some point tries to leverage God's power to their own benefit. And it's not that they're trying to scheme. It's not that you're trying to be devious. You just are in a desperate situation, and you realize wisely that things are out of your control. And so we appeal to someone who hopefully has ultimate control, God. And so a situation arises or a need comes our way, and the bargaining begins. God, if you let me get that job. God, if you help save my marriage. God, if you answer my prayer. God, if you would just heal that person, then I will fill in the blank. Go to church, start giving, start serving, start reading my Bible. If God behaves in the way that I want God to behave, then I will behave in the way that God wants me to behave. We'll both be happy, everyone gets their way, and everyone wins. But what happens when God doesn't behave in the way that you want God to behave? What happens if the marriage falls apart? If the prayer doesn't get answered the way you wanted? What happens if the person never gets better? We're in a series of messages we're calling Villains, where we're looking at some of the most notorious characters in the New Testament that had to do with the crucifixion of Jesus. I was in my van driving with my 7-year-old, and we were talking about a movie that we were going to watch later that night. And she said, "Dad, I don't want to watch that movie. It has a scary part in it." And then she thought a little bit more, and she said, "You know what, Dad? Every movie has a scary part in it. Because every movie has a bad guy, and bad guys are scary." I'm like, there's truth in that. There's truth in that. Every good story has this battle baked into the plot between good and evil, right? Luke has Darth, and Batman has Joker, and Zoolander has Mugatu, and Dora has Swiper, right? It's just baked right into the plot. Classic film like Dora, which is better than some stuff that's out there, just saying. Anyway, the Bible is really no different in this sense. And today we're looking at possibly the most notorious villain, not just in the Bible, but in history. We're looking at someone who has become synonymous with treason and betrayal, and of course that is Judas. Now, whether you've been to church 1,000 times before, or maybe this is your very first visit, whether you've opened up the Bible and you've read it front to back 10 times over, or you've never cracked it open, we kind of just know that Judas is a bad dude. He's a bad dude because of what he did. He betrayed Jesus. But what we don't always understand is why Judas did it. And when we zoom out, we look a little broader and deeper at Judas's life, we get this picture of why he did what he did, and we realize that Judas did what he did because Jesus didn't do what Judas wanted Jesus to do. So some background on Judas, just to make his life a little bit more textured and give us some context. Judas was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, and disciple really isn't a religious word. All it means is apprentice. That word was used often in this time frame, and it still is used. It's not a religious word, it just means apprentice. Judas made a deep commitment to Jesus, okay? And there's no reason to think that Judas wasn't anything but sincere in his faith. Sometimes we think Judas was a bad egg from the beginning, but that's not true. Just like the rest of the disciples, Judas thought Jesus was of such extraordinary worth that he left everything in order to follow him. But unlike the rest of the disciples, Judas wasn't from the same place that all the other disciples, including Jesus, were from. All the other disciples and Jesus were from Galilee. Judas was from a place called Judea. Judas goes by the title Judas Iscariot, which is an important title because Judas is a common name in first century Israel, and there are 8 other Judases in the New Testament. But he's identified as Judas Iscariot, and Iscariot just means a man of Kerioth, and Kerioth is a town in Judea. And Judeans were really proud of their heritage. They were pure-blooded Jews. They were educated, they were cultured, but Galileans, they were mixed blood. They are Gentiles and non-Jews in the area. They were often poor and uneducated. So Judas was kind of cut from a different cloth. He was trusted by Jesus and his disciples as the treasurer of the bunch. He was the CFO of the Jesus operation. Now, most Bible scholars and commentators tell us that Judas had a particular thought of who Jesus was going to be and who he could be. Judas hoped that Jesus was going to be what the Bible describes as the Messiah. Now, the Messiah, we can't really miss this. It's the most important figure in the Jewish worldview. He's the person that people have been waiting hundreds and thousands of years to arrive on the scene. And people were excited about this, particularly in this time in history, because Messiah meant promised deliverer. And Judas understandably believed that Jesus was going to be a sort of a military or political leader because Rome had invaded Israel and were occupying Israel. And Judas and much of the Jews wanted to be independent. They wanted to go back to the glory days of King David and King Solomon. And Judas hoped that Jesus was going to be this type of leader. And Jesus, in many ways, he acted the way Judas thought a Messiah should act. You know, there's an Old Testament book called Isaiah, and in it describes what this Messiah, this long-awaited promised deliverer, some of the characteristics and trait of this person. And Isaiah says that this Messiah will heal the blind and the deaf and the lame, will raise the dead and preach the good news to the poor. Jesus ticked all those boxes, which isn't an easy thing to do. Jesus even identified himself at one time as the very person that Isaiah was talking about. So Jesus, in many ways, behaved just like Judas thought the Messiah should behave, but not always. There's three big things about Jesus' life that would have raised some suspicion for Judas. The first one is this. Jesus didn't seem to hate the Romans, not as much as Judas did. And that seems to be a problem if you're going to try to overthrow them. That would have raised suspicion for Judas. Number two, Jesus was at odds with the temple leaders. If you're going to overthrow Rome, you had to unite Israel, and Israel was really centered around the temple and its temple leaders, and Jesus really seemed to be causing a little bit of division with them. He always seemed to be poking them a little bit. And lastly, and maybe most importantly for Judas, Jesus didn't seem overly concerned with money. If you're going to fund a campaign to overthrow the Romans, you need a war chest. You need a lot of money. But Jesus was constantly practicing irrational generosity, which as the treasurer and the money keeper would have made Judas so mad. And there's this particular incident recorded in the New Testament that we see this at play. We see this incident as the very last straw for Judas, where he just couldn't handle it anymore. And this incident's recorded in the book of Matthew, and Matthew was a disciple of Jesus, but also a friend of Judas. So there's some interesting things going on here, and he records this story for us that we're going to look at. It's in Matthew 26, and it says this. Well, Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of Simon the leper. We actually have no idea who Simon the leper is. The people in the first century who would have read this story in this account, they knew, oh, Simon the leper, we don't know who he is. A woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. Can we just stop for a moment? Okay, if you've been in church for a while, you read that and you're like, yeah, keep going. But okay, let's just point out something. If I'm at your house and you invite me over for a barbecue and unsuspectingly you surprise dump a jar of perfume on my head, and it's in my eyes and in my mouth and on my chicken, I'm not happy about that, okay? But that's what happened. It would have been weird for a first century Jew, but for us reading this, you're just like, what's going on here? Now, another disciple by the name of John, he also records this story and gives us a little bit more texture and detail as to what's happening. And he lets us know that this jar of perfume was worth an entire year's wage. To put that in perspective, the average Canadian full-time wage is $55,000. Imagine using $55,000 in one shot like this. And we can't. It's out of scope for us. It's too generous. It blows our mind. It's insane. And that's what the disciples thought. They were mad about this. This is what the story says. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. Why this waste, they asked. This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor. But John tells us it was Judas who was particularly mad and stirred up all the other disciples. And he wasn't mad because this money could be given to the poor, because Judas was actually stealing from the treasury at the time. But he's mad. Why this waste? So Jesus responds to Judas and the rest of the disciples, and he says this. Why are you bothering this woman? She's done a beautiful thing to me. Jesus is like, guys, mind your business, which is a really good spiritual principle, FYI. Mind your business. It's her perfume. She can use it however she wants. If she wants to sell it, she can sell it. If she wants to use it on me in this scenario, let her do that. Besides, she's honored me. Why are you mad about that? But what Jesus says next pushes Judas right over the edge. Jesus continues. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. What do you mean burial? We're betting on you. If you die, where does that leave us? What are we even doing here if you're planning on dying? And are you throwing in the towel? What do you mean, burial? No. This is not what we signed up for. This would have been challenging for every disciple to hear, but especially Judas, because you can't overthrow the Romans if you're dead. Judas has spent 3 years following Jesus, and he's not turning out to be the person that he would hoped he was going to. Jesus didn't behave the way that Judas wanted Jesus to behave. And Judas isn't sure, can I trust Jesus anymore? Now, that's kind of the backstory to Judas, which makes this next part make sense. If you don't know that part, this next part seems like a knee-jerk, harsh reaction, but it really isn't. This has been building in Judas for a while, and the story continues and says this. Then, meaning like right that moment, right after Jesus said this, one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. And from then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. See, we learned this a couple weeks ago, but the chief priests, they wanted Jesus dead because Jesus was a threat to them, to their stature, to their power, to their way of life. But the people, the crowds, they loved Jesus. And wherever Jesus went, so did these big crowds. And so these chief priests, they didn't really have a good opportunity to seize and kill Jesus. And so Judas thought, this is kind of a botched Messiah operation in my opinion. And so I'm not going to walk away from this thing empty-handed. I have some knowledge of Jesus' itinerary. I can use that. I can sell that. People are willing to pay me money for it. So I'm going to make the most out of a bad situation. And so he doesn't walk away empty-handed. And he trades Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver is the approximate price of a slave in the first century. And I say that only to say this is not a lot of money at all. How could Judas trade Jesus for so little? Judas walked with Jesus for 3 years, as up close and personal as you can get. When Jesus fed the 5,000, Judas was right there. When Jesus calmed the storm and commanded the weather, Judas was right there. When Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, Judas was right there. Judas heard all of Jesus' teaching, the Sermon on the Mount. Judas knew that narrow was the road to life and wide was the road to destruction. He heard the story of the prodigal son. Many times over, he would have heard it. He knew that God was loving and full of grace and kindness and forgiveness. With his eyes, he saw the undeniable evidence of the Messiah. With his ears, he heard the finest teaching ever recorded. With his feet, he followed the greatest example of all. And yet, he still betrayed Jesus. What was of extraordinary value in one moment had no value in the next. How could Judas go so wrong? If you will, then I will. Judas's relationship with Jesus was built on a bargain. If Jesus behaved the way that Judas wanted Jesus to behave, then Judas would behave. But Judas couldn't control Jesus. He couldn't manipulate Jesus. He couldn't make Jesus do what he wanted him to do in the way that he wanted him to do it. And in his disappointment, in his unmet expectations, Judas makes a trade, and now he has to come through on this trade. He has to actually find an opportunity to hand over Jesus. And one presents itself one night in a garden called Gethsemane, and the story continues like this. While he was still speaking of being Jesus, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." And the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. I was struck by Jesus' response. I've read it 100 times, but I was struck that Jesus, in the middle of being betrayed by one of his closest friends, can look tenderheartedly at Judas, and still call him friend. You still do that. Jesus didn't just preach about loving your enemies. We see it in vivid color right here. And you have to understand, if you're here today and you have done something and you are not proud of it, and maybe there's shame or guilt attached to it, and you think that Jesus looks on you with contempt, it's not true. Jesus looks on you with love. Jesus is called the friend of sinners. And he would look at you today, whatever your situation in, and he would look at you and say, "You're my friend. I count you as my friend." How you respond to Jesus is your responsibility. But Jesus looks at you and says, "You're my friend." So Jesus is arrested. He's brought before the courts, and this sort of mock trial takes place. Remember the chief priests, the guys with the power, guys with the stature, they wanted Jesus dead, and so they cook up some charges, they bring in false witnesses, and they find Jesus guilty of blasphemy, which in Old Testament law was punishable by death. And so Jesus, in front of this court, he actually declares, he says, "Yes, I am the Messiah." And to put it mildly, this rubbed the chief priests the wrong way. And so the story still continues and says this. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Now, Pilate, he represented Rome, and there was really only one reason that the Jews would go to Pilate and go to Rome. Because Rome, they could execute people, but Jews in this time, they were not able to because of the Roman occupation. So in order to kill Jesus, in order to get him executed, they had to go to Rome. And Judas knew this was the case. Continuing on, when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said. I have betrayed innocent blood. And I absolutely love their response, and I don't think it could be any more true. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. Judas realized things were spinning totally out of control. Judas was disloyal to Jesus for a momentary gain, but he didn't think that this was going to happen. Jesus has a death sentence, and this is Judas's responsibility. And so he's immediately seized with remorse and guilt, and he tries to give back the 30 pieces of silver. Take it. I'm sorry. I wish this never happened. I wish I can go back and do things differently. Now, at this point in the timeline, in the story of Judas, you could look at him and really, I imagine, have two different types of responses. And I have flip-flopped over both of them this week. Some of you might be thinking, if Judas only knew what he was doing, and you have compassion, and you get it, and all of a sudden he doesn't seem that villainous. Or you think, Judas should have known. You never betray a friend like that. Whatever Judas has coming to him, he deserves. I don't know where you sit on that, but I do know this, that I am a lot like Judas. See, every time that I sin, and really every time that you sin, anytime that we do something that we know we ought not to do, every time that we do something immoral, every time we move outside of what we know is God's best for us, every time we're disloyal to Jesus, even for a moment, we are making a trade. We make a trade. We're trading what we wanted Jesus to do for us or who we wanted Jesus to be for us with something else. When we sin, we're saying, Jesus isn't fulfilling me the way that I thought he would or he used to, so I'm going to go somewhere else. I'm going to find my joy somewhere else. I'm going to find my peace somewhere else. Maybe I'll find it in buying more stuff. I'm not finding fulfillment in Jesus, so maybe I'll find it in engaging in gossip or looking at pornography or giving into my anger or embracing selfishness. The question is, what is it that you're tempted to trade your relationship with Jesus for? And we make these trades. And we think it's a good trade at the time. We are disloyal to Jesus even for a moment, for a small gain. And then we realize, just like Judas, this wasn't worth it. I wish this never happened. I wish I can go back and do things differently. And in that way, we're all a lot like Judas. We've experienced the goodness of Jesus up close and personal. We have seen him miraculously provide for us. He has calmed the storms in our life. He has answered our prayers. We've heard all the teaching. We know, we've heard the Sermon on the Mount. We know that narrow is the gate to life and wide is the road to destruction. We've heard the parable of the prodigal son. We know how good and kind and loving and forgiving God is. With our own eyes, we have seen undeniable evidence. With our own ears, we've heard the finest teaching. With our feet, we followed the best example, yet we're still tempted to betray Jesus for something of no value. And when we do that, we find ourselves in the same place as Judas, filled with remorse, thinking the trade was worth it. And we undermine our own happiness as we trade it in for 30 pieces of silver. When we trade Jesus, who is of ultimate worth, for something worthless, that's your responsibility. You and your relationship with Jesus is no one's responsibility but yours. And today you get to choose what that looks like. But the story of Jesus reminds us that nothing good can come from trading in on your relationship with Jesus, not even for a moment. And that's a whole lot easier to do if we don't see God as someone to manipulate or control. The ending of Judas' story is absolutely tragic. It reads this: Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and he hanged himself. This is obviously an incredibly sad ending to Judas's life. And the thing is, it could have and it should have been different. Judas didn't have to do this. Remember, Jesus looked at him and he called him his friend. Sin does that. Sin has a way of tricking us into thinking that there is no redemption, that there is no second chance, that there is no future. But in Jesus, there always is redemption and a second chance, and there is a future. But the if you will, then I will bargain style of faith, it just doesn't work. It will destroy your relationship with God just like it did for Judas, because there are going to be times when God doesn't behave the way that you want him to, when things don't work out the way that you think they should have, and your prayers aren't answered the way that you hope. And what do you do? What do you do when God doesn't behave the way that you want him to behave? You look to the cross. When you look at the cross, you see a God that you can trust. You see a perfect love that is not manipulative, that doesn't try to bargain you for your affection. It's a love without any conditions. When we see Jesus on the cross, what we don't see is a if you will, then I will situation. If you will just devote your life to me, then I will die on the cross for you. No. What we see is a Jesus who says this: I will, even if you won't. I will forgive you, even if what you've done seems unforgivable. I will love you, even if you turn away from me. I will call you friend, even if you betray me. And I don't know about you, but this sort of love, it captures my attention. It demands my trust. God, he doesn't need me to love him in order for him to love me. But his love for me leaves me no choice but to love him back. His love compels me to love him. John, again, a friend of Jesus and Judas, he put it this way in the New Testament: we love because he first loved us. Jesus is so good. When we are able to surrender our lives to God's love and we're not tempted to manipulate God to our own benefit, we realize that the benefit in following Jesus is to be known by him and to know him. And a relationship with God isn't something to be leveraged, it's not something to be controlled, but it's something to be enjoyed because Jesus is of such extraordinary worth. And don't trade it for anything. Let me pray. God, we admit that we've made too many trades that looking back on, we wish we didn't. Even now, Lord, as we've listened to your word, we thank you that you're bringing to mind areas of our life that we've been willing to compromise on in a relationship with you, even just for a small momentary gain. But God, would we be a church? Would we be a people who find nothing more valuable than knowing you and being known by you? And so, Holy Spirit, we pray and we ask for your conviction in our life, not to condemn us, but in order to draw us closer to you. And Jesus, for those people in this place who are here for the first time hearing about your love, and they want to experience it for themselves, they want to understand it in a more open way, Lord, would you give them courage, even right in this moment, to open their spirit to yours, and would you speak to them? Lord, help us to understand you don't look at us with contempt, but with love. Would the gravity of our weight and our sin be real to us, not to bring shame, but so that we can clearly understand your work on the cross? And would that come alive in our hearts and minds? And would we turn from our sin and not make those trades and live a life loyal to you? Lord, you are of extraordinary worth. We thank you. Amen. If today you're here and you're saying, I don't know what's with the set, what's going on, but you say, I'm interested in learning what it looks like to follow Christ. I just want to ask you to do one simple thing. Just text the word life to number 558. We don't track those numbers and details. We just want to give you an opportunity to receive a little ebook that can help you understand what that looks like. Also have an opportunity to talk to a pastor if you'd like. You don't have to, but if you'd like. Guys, this at 3 p.m. today, we have another performance. We're going to have about 1,500 people or so in here. Last night, we had 19 people make that decision to follow Jesus, which is incredible. Yeah, that's great. Would you be praying this afternoon for all those in attendance, that they would experience the life-changing, transforming love of God? Have a great week.